Australian Marxist feminist grandma tells a British migrant story and asks for a favour from you and the Pope. For what else is the life of man but a kind of play in which men in various costumes perform until the director motions them off stage? Erasmus said that in The Praise of Folly, first printed in 1511. First the story, then the pitch to invite Pope Francis to the National Botanic Gardens in Canberra to implement his encyclical on climate change and inequality, Our Common Home. Carol. All the world's a stage, and one girl in her time plays many parts. This is my story. I was born in England in the winter of 1947, the post-war baby of the Brown family, 16 years after the last of three much older siblings, my brother and two sisters. My mother was 46 when I was born, and I was the spoilt baby of the family. During the Second World War, my father had worked as a maintenance mechanic for fighter planes. The rest of the family was evacuated to Purley Park outside London. After the war, he bought a bicycle shop in Southend-on-Sea. My mother and teenage sister and I lived with Dad in the shop before we came to Australia by boat in 1953. I hardly knew my brother and eldest sister. She married a career soldier raised in the army. You see her as a bride with me as a flower girl in this picture taken in England before we sailed, with my younger sister acting as a bridesmaid and my parents beside her. My brother became an engineer in Kuwait before going to California and working on the space program. My parents and two older siblings are dead now. Death is of great interest to me, as I come from the first generation of women to gain reliable control over their reproduction of children. We also want to die well. In going to Australia, my parents wanted to escape the austerity of post-war life in England and the increasing threat of a Third World War in Europe. We first joined my mother's older brother and his very religious wife in Kandanga, Queensland, working on his pineapple and banana farm. It was not a happy family match, so we moved to Brisbane, and my father tried being a chicken farmer, as well as doing other kinds of farming, not very successfully. He became a milkman when the population of professional families in the semi-rural suburb of Kenmore was growing bigger by immigration and natural increase. This is a picture of the Australian branch of the family at the beach. My sister married an English migrant she met in Australia and had two children, with a third later. She lives in Brisbane today. This is my dad with my sister's children in front of the house he built for us on land he bought in Chapel Hill, Brisbane. He was a clever and largely self-taught man, interested in reading and building and fixing things, with strong left-wing views and no friend of organised religion. He loved Australia in spite of many difficulties the new life presented. My mother missed her family, the English way of life, and the English countryside a great deal for many years. I often felt sad for her and wished I could protect her better from my father's temper, although he is not violent, and I felt sorry for them both as they aged and grew increasingly infirm in different ways. I guess my sister mainly thinks of them in earlier, happier and healthier times than I do. When I was at Taringa Primary School, my parents took me back to England thinking we might stay. Even Mum agreed, however, that we would be better off in Australia, so we returned to Brisbane. These are pictures taken by the Courier Mail when my class came to see me off on the trip. I went to Indooroopilly High School but did a commercial course, unlike most of my friends, and left school at 15 to become a shorthand typist. I was happy to be leaving school, as I wanted what I thought of as the freedom of earning my own money. Here are some of us girls from the typing pool at Queensland University, which had first pick of the local commercial crop each year. I'd loved school but hated work as a typist because I found it so boring. When my boyfriend dropped me in preference for study and sport, I was so deeply unhappy I decided to do night school studies after work. It cheered me up. This is a picture of him in the locket he gave me. The result is that as an adult I never diminished the pain of loss on the young. especially if when they never hear of it. I won a scholarship to Queensland University to become a high school teacher. 1966 was my first year in an arts degree comprising mainly English and history subjects, plus French. I loved everything about university. I felt like I'd died and gone to heaven, being introduced to so many new and wonderful ideas, activities and people who were usually men. I often wonder if many young people today feel like that about university or not, and I've got no idea. Met my husband, who was a civil engineering student in the University of Queensland Bushwalking Club. I encouraged him and other friends to join demonstrations against the US war on Vietnam. My father was strongly supportive and would come and bail me out of Watch House any time I landed there. Around that time I got an ASIO record, which I saw recently in Canberra. Its sympathetic accuracy gave me a new respect for the Australian public service of the times, and I remembered Quakers and Newman Society Christians organised the first demonstrations I went to in support of the North Vietnamese government against the US. My husband and I married and graduated in 1968. We left immediately to travel around Europe, usually hitchhiking and camping. Following a year in Europe, we spent one in Brisbane, then worked for 2 years in Kano, northern Nigeria, with Australian volunteers abroad. While he worked as a civil engineer, I taught English in Government Boys College in Kano. It was the early 70s after the Biafran War, when the Christian southern tribes who lived upon oil and whose Western educated presence dominated the Nigerian public service sought unsuccessfully to secede from the Islamic North. After the war, the Nigerian states were run by military governors and foreigners were preferred in many jobs once filled by Nigerians. I guess little has changed in Kano State since then, besides increasing population and deserts also leading to the rise of the current Islamic terrorist group, Boko Haram. I felt I was an unhappy and disenchanted burden on my husband in Nigeria. We ended the marriage amicably on returning to Australia, splitting our meagre goods between us. Then I went to Melbourne to live with friends who were also high school teachers and with the man who would become the father of our daughter, born in 1977. He was an old friend from Queensland University who was a disillusioned geologist searching for molybdenite in New South Wales. It's used in steel manufacture. He was constantly trying to get work in national parks and wildlife instead. Happily, he finally succeeded. This is him holding our daughter with the bonnet on one arm and a friend's baby on the other. From Melbourne, we moved back to Sydney. In 1974, some friends and I, including my former husband, bought a ramshackle 6-bedroom house in Bridge Road, Glebe, for a cost of $28,000, as I recall. We were all working or going back to study at Sydney University. He remarried later and went to Cambridge after retraining as an economist. The big collective house in Bridge Road, Glebe, that I found because I was planning to stay and have a child within a few years was very cheap because it was supposed to be knocked down as a result of the Los Angeles-style freeway that was planned to come throughout Ultimo and many other suburbs, including Glebe. We helped to stop this happening. In Melbourne and in inner city Sydney, as a teacher and as a postgraduate student in education, I've become increasingly involved with Marxist and feminist thought and activity. This included through resident and community demonstrations trying to halt freeway building, which would otherwise destroy many historic Sydney suburbs. These pictures show the Fig Street demonstration in which protesters climbed onto the rooftops of houses being demolished by bulldozers. Once police had caught some of us, they let us off with a warning. However, most protesters felt duty-bound to repeat the process. As a result, the Fig Street demonstrations lasted for hours and was amazingly tiring. The actions of residents and unions, such as the Builders Labourers Federation, Many people today are living in some of the most expensive, beautiful and historic real estate and gardens in the country. Other countries got the inner city concrete jungles so common with freeway development or lived far away from the city. Politics can often be mystifying as well as local in my experience. Life is often like that, I guess. I became a founding member of the Radical Education Group in 1976 and joined the Communist Party of Australia around the same time. These are typical Red G magazine covers. I left the Communist Party when I got a job with the New South Wales Public Service after teaching sociology at the University of Western Sydney. This was also after completing a PhD in sociology at Macquarie University, where I was a tutor in education. My PhD was a study of the reasons for the changing labour market allocation of males and females in key jobs in 4 industries in New South Wales during the 20th century. In 1984 it was published by Allen and Unwin as The Basis of the Bargain, Gender, Schooling and Jobs. Throughout the 80s I wrote books with friends about family violence and on political and industrial issues in childcare, as well as writing about many other areas of women's work, education and reproductive or sexual health. Here are some book covers typical of the issues we discuss and often acted upon at the time. In 1985, I became the Assistant Director of the new Women's Directorate that the Director and I were to set up in the head office of the New South Wales Department of Industrial Relations and Employment. The job was to help implement new anti-discrimination legislation with programs to improve the status of women at work. I then helped set up the New South Wales Work Cover Authority and its programs. In the 1980s, all Australian states and territories introduced occupational health and safety acts. These gave people a general duty of care at work. They were also key acts for gaining more broadly and openly informed risk management, which could interact better with data-driven national healthcare and insurance systems. New state occupational health and safety acts were supported by new and openly shared government and industry programs for managing injured workers' rehabilitation and related compensation and insurance services and funds better than either the public or private sector could do alone. I found myself constantly learning and writing about policy and programs for injury prevention, rehabilitation and insurance fund management and data. This became obsessively interesting to me and the key foundations for the rest of my free working life and travel in retirement as well as earlier in paid work. After 10 years in the New South Wales Public Service, I took the Golden Boot when it was offered and went to teach sociology and health service policy in the Faculty of Health Sciences at Sydney University. These are the inhabitants of our Glebe household shortly before that time, and also before this big old house was sold, and I moved up the road with my daughter the year before her high school certificate to live at St James Court. I love living in Glebe and will remain where I am now, living alone until death, I guess. These are courses I developed and taught at the University of Sydney. They're on my website with many other articles and submissions to inquiries. These link sociological and international, regional or local planning and development directions, have risk and project management practices that are often competitively based on the International Declaration of Human Rights, as it may be applied in diverse historical and regional environments. I'd also started to encourage students to make short films as an alternative form of expression for assessment. 2 are shown here, for example. I took a management offer to retire from work in 2007, age 60. And then the global financial crisis came in 2008, fueling my interest in land, housing and retirement incomes policy, including superannuation. Housing is a universal common need which is ideally managed more like health services than purely in the market. The global financial crisis was substantially driven by US housing policy. Australia needs to find a different path to protect its population better, as has already been done in the design of Australian healthcare, which is much cheaper and more equitably delivered than US healthcare, as well as being of high quality. The general aim is for more open regional planning and strategic development designed to achieve environmental and social goals as well as economic ones. This is triple bottom line accounting. Competition based purely on price often turns out to be more expensive because of the poor service delivery, business failure and loss which accompanies it. Policy sets out to correct some of these faults. Since she left high school, my daughter's worked in conservation and preservation at the State Library. She continued to study part-time and recently finished a PhD in environmental studies with a thesis dealing with land, water and seed bank relationships. She and her partner met over the internet and live in Sydney. This is a picture of them and my beautiful grandson Louis. To look back on being a child followed by being a mother and now a grandma is an education in itself. And now to the pitch. Invite Pope Francis to the National Botanic Gardens in Canberra to tell him some Australian stories for implementation of his encyclical on climate change and inequality, On Care for Our Common Home. His guidance or comment would naturally be welcomed by all Australians and beyond. I urge you to contact your MP or a related relevant organisation to invite the Pope to Canberra to discuss how his encyclical on climate change and inequality should be implemented in our common environment. Start with consideration of representative endangered species and their habitat. The regional aim is to give the most vulnerable species vital saving attention first, plus supporting employment for locals. If this isn't done, for example, in China's international One Belt Road trading strategy, the most vulnerable species habitat will continue to be wiped out through deforestation and water degradation, so the poorest people may increasingly also live in deserts or flee to urban slums. Without central attention in planning and production to the protection of global biodiversity, current and future generations will never have the chance to know about, let alone experience, this historic richness. The Australian National Gardens are across the road from the Australian National University near beautiful Lake Burley Griffin, around which Canberra is built. The gardens give you a chance to explore Australia's diverse and spectacular flora. The 35 hectares are displayed in taxonomic or plant groupings and geographic regions. With over 6,300 plant species, this is the only place in the world you will see the diversity of Australian national plants in one location. This is a key context for preservation of our common home. B.A. Santa Maria once wrote to Father George Pell, now in the Vatican, to agree with the latter's statement that the main challenge and the great task come from those anti-Christian forces who, especially in the media and in legislation, are destroying the Christian bases of our way of life. We must recognise this and fight it. I have instead urged upon the university vice-chancellors, politicians and many others that we should work together openly instead. Don't let markets take over driving via the old-fashioned treasury and secretive, legal, bureaucratic and professional or collegiate interests, enshrined in law or not. Turn to media and open investigation and work instead to support regional and related strategic planning directions which protect the most vulnerable species first. I would gladly address any proposals in funding or in kind made in the light of many personal security aims and interests discussed in the context of global and local goals at www.carolodonnell.com.